The opening functions as an aggressive interruption of habitual media consumption, deliberately violating the unspoken contract of casual scrolling. The command, "Stop scrolling," is not merely a call for attention, it is an assertion of authority that reframes ordinary viewing behavior as inappropriate, negligent, even disrespectful. In doing so, the video establishes itself as categorically different from surrounding content. It is no longer entertainment, information, or inspiration, but an emergency transmission. This reframing is crucial. Once the viewer accepts that the content exists outside normal media logic, the usual evaluative defenses, skepticism, comparison, boredom, are temporarily suspended. The viewer is no longer choosing to watch. They are being addressed. Immediately following this interruption, the listener is instructed to perform a physical action. Look at your hands, your face, your reflection. This redirection of attention inward serves several psychological functions at once. First, it disrupts external reference points. Rather than evaluating the message against evidence or prior knowledge, the listener is asked to consult their own body as the primary site of verification. Second, it anchors the message somatically rather than cognitively. The body becomes the locus of meaning before the mind has time to interpret. This creates a brief, dissociative pause, a liminal state in which self-perception becomes unusually malleable. In that moment, the listener is primed to reinterpret neutral sensations, stillness, familiarity, even uncertainty, as significant. The invocation of a precise time window, exactly 10 seconds, intensifies this effect. Time pressure narrows attention and reduces reflective capacity. The viewer is not asked to think, but to comply. Compliance precedes comprehension. By the time the listener has completed the instruction, they are already participating in the narrative. This participation is not symbolic, it is embodied. The body has been recruited before belief is articulated. The next move is the declaration that something scientifically impossible is already happening. This claim is strategically framed in the present continuous tense. It is not a promise, not a warning, not a future revelation. It is an assertion about the listener's current state. This timing matters. By asserting that the phenomenon is already underway, the speaker collapses skepticism before it can form. Skepticism requires distance, temporal, cognitive, or evidential. Here, distance is denied. If the event is already happening, disbelief risks being reframed as ignorance rather than discernment. The phrase "scientifically impossible" functions less as a factual claim than as a boundary marker. It signals that conventional frameworks, biology, medicine, aging, probability, are insufficient and should be suspended. This preemptively disqualifies external verification, while paradoxically invoking the authority of science to heighten drama. Science is named only to be transcended. The listener is not invited to test the claim, but to accept that testing itself is inadequate. The assertion that the listener is aging backward is especially effective because it exploits a universally sensitive domain, appearance and time. Aging anxiety is widespread, socially reinforced, and emotionally charged. By introducing the idea of reverse aging, the message activates hope, vanity, fear, and curiosity simultaneously. Yet the claim is carefully insulated from falsification. Aging backward is not operationally defined. It does not require measurable reversal. It only requires perception, yours or others. This allows the listener to supply their own evidence retroactively. Crucially, the speaker anticipates doubt by invoking third-party observers, strangers staring, old friends doing double takes, whispering. These images externalize validation. The listener is not asked to trust their own judgment alone, which might feel unreliable, but to reinterpret ambiguous social feedback as confirmation. Ordinary interactions, glances, compliments, curiosity, are reframed as involuntary recognition of an underlying truth. The ambiguity of social perception becomes an asset rather than a liability. If people notice you, it proves the claim. If they do not, it simply has not manifested fully yet. At this stage, ordinary biology is declared insufficient to explain the listener's experience. Genetics, skincare, lifestyle, and chance are all explicitly dismissed. This monopolization of explanation is critical. By eliminating alternative causes without examination, the speaker positions themselves as the sole interpretive authority. If no conventional explanation applies, then only the speaker's framework remains. The listener is not choosing between interpretations. They are being guided toward the only one presented as viable. Urgency, secrecy, and elevation are layered simultaneously. The listener is told that something extraordinary is happening now, that it is hidden from most people, and that they are among the few experiencing it. This triad is psychologically potent. Urgency accelerates compliance, secrecy heightens value, and elevation flatters identity. Together, they create a closed emotional circuit in which disbelief feels not just incorrect, but self-sabotaging. To doubt is to risk missing something rare, personal, and time-sensitive. Early calls to action, subscribe, turn on notifications, comment, are embedded before substantive explanation appears. This sequencing is not accidental. Engagement is solicited at the moment of highest arousal, before the listener has the information necessary to evaluate the claim. By the time evaluation becomes possible, the listener has already invested attention, identity, and public signal. Commenting a number or subscribing is framed not as platform behavior, but as alignment, agreement, even protection. This converts algorithmic engagement into symbolic commitment. The insistence that the message found you, rather than the viewer finding the message, further removes agency. Discovery is reframed as destiny. Randomness is eliminated. The algorithm disappears. Instead, the listener is positioned as the endpoint of intentional selection. This narrative move resolves existential uncertainty by offering a sense of order. Your life was drifting. Now it is corrected. The video is not content, it is intervention. The speaker's role is carefully constructed. They do not present as a teacher offering information, nor as a motivator offering encouragement. They position themselves as a witness to hidden activity, someone with access to knowledge the listener does not yet possess. This creates asymmetry. The listener is dependent, not because they are ignorant, but because the knowledge is framed as inaccessible without mediation. Authority flows not from evidence, but from proximity to the unseen. Throughout the opening, skepticism is not directly confronted. It is bypassed. The listener is not asked to believe a proposition, but to notice a feeling, a sensation, a resonance. Vague inner experiences, restlessness, curiosity, unease, are validated in advance. If the listener feels anything at all, it can be interpreted as confirmation. This technique converts ambiguity into personalization. The message feels intimate without having to be accurate. The opening also establishes a subtle threat of loss. Phrases like, "before this video ends," and references to withheld revelations create a countdown effect. Attention is framed as fragile. Disengagement becomes costly. Missing a moment now implies missing it forever. Scarcity is temporal rather than material, which makes it harder to verify and easier to internalize. By the end of the opening sequence, the listener has been repositioned in multiple ways, from passive consumer to addressed subject, from ordinary individual to potential exception, from skeptic to participant. Their body has been invoked as evidence, their social interactions reframed as signs, their curiosity leveraged as commitment. Crucially, All of this occurs before any verifiable claim is made. The groundwork is laid not for belief, but for reinterpretation. Whatever comes next will not be evaluated on its own merits. It will be filtered through the identity and expectations established here. In this sense, the opening does not merely introduce the message, it constructs the interpretive environment in which the message will be received. It narrows the range of possible responses while preserving the illusion of personal discovery. The listener feels chosen, but that feeling is engineered. The message feels urgent, but that urgency is manufactured. The authority feels external and transcendent, but it is produced through narrative control rather than evidence. What makes the opening particularly effective is that it does not demand explicit belief. It demands attention, compliance, and emotional openness. Belief is allowed to emerge later, framed as recognition rather than acceptance. By the time the listener reaches that point, the cost of disbelief is no longer merely intellectual. It threatens identity, meaning, and the promise of exceptionality that has already been offered. The narrative then tightens its grip by reinterpreting everyday social interactions as external proof of divine intervention. Ordinary phenomena, glances that linger, casual compliments, momentary curiosity, are stripped of their social and psychological neutrality and recoded as theological signals. What would normally be understood as subjective perception, politeness, coincidence, or situational context is reframed as involuntary recognition. Attention from others is no longer ambiguous. It is diagnostic. To be noticed is to be confirmed. This move is subtle but powerful because it converts the social environment into a feedback system that continuously reinforces the narrative. Human beings are constantly observed by others, and small cues, eye contact, tone shifts, offhand remarks, are ubiquitous. By assigning supernatural meaning to these cues, the narrative ensures a steady supply of evidence without requiring any extraordinary event to occur. The world becomes saturated with confirmation, not because reality has changed, but because interpretation has been rerouted. Crucially, alternative explanations are not debated, they are quietly erased. Lighting, styling, posture, mood, confidence, aging variance, or simple projection are never addressed. Their absence is not accidental. To acknowledge them would reopen the possibility of natural causation. Instead, the narrative performs a kind of interpretive foreclosure. There is only one valid explanation, and it is already supplied. This prevents the listener from holding multiple hypotheses in mind. Social attention is no longer something to interpret, it is something to accept. The emphasis on skeptics being confused serves an even more strategic function. Skepticism, which would normally operate as a counterforce, is absorbed and inverted. If skeptics notice something and cannot explain it, their confusion is reframed as confirmation. Doubt no longer threatens the claim, it strengthens it. This creates a closed epistemic loop in which disbelief itself becomes evidence. Any reaction, belief, curiosity, confusion, denial, can be assimilated into the narrative without friction. This maneuver neutralizes critical thought without openly attacking it. The listener is not told that skepticism is wrong. They are told that skepticism has already failed. Others have tried to doubt and were unable to reconcile what they saw.
The implication is clear. Questioning is not only unnecessary, it is outdated. The listener is positioned as already ahead of the curve, possessing an interpretive key that others lack. At the same time, responsibility for interpretation is subtly shifted away from the listener. They are not asked to judge whether something is happening. They are told that others have already noticed it. This externalizes validation and reduces internal uncertainty. If people are staring, commenting, whispering, then the conclusion feels less like belief and more like acknowledgement. The listener is not choosing to see themselves as changed. They are merely accepting what is allegedly obvious to everyone else. The phrase, "they don't know what they're seeing," is especially effective here. It frames recognition as involuntary and pre-rational. Others see something before they understand it. This elevates perception over interpretation and casts the phenomenon as undeniable. If people react without comprehension, then what they are reacting to must be real. The logic is circular, but emotionally persuasive. Over time, this reframing trains the listener to monitor social interactions for confirmation rather than information. Instead of asking, "What might explain this?" the listener is encouraged to ask, "How does this prove it?" Ambiguity is no longer a space for reflection. It is a resource to be harvested. Every look becomes a data point. Every comment becomes a sign. Even silence can be interpreted as awe or intimidation. This has the effect of collapsing the distinction between internal belief and external reality. The listener's self-concept begins to align with the narrative because the social world is perceived as mirroring it back. Importantly, this mirroring is interpretive, not empirical, but it feels objective because it involves other people. The self is validated not by evidence, but by attention. In this way, the narrative turns ordinary social life into a continuous ritual of confirmation. The listener does not need miracles, transformations, or measurable change. They only need to keep watching how others look at them and to interpret those looks correctly. The world itself becomes the proof system, and the narrative supplies the lens through which it must be seen. Here the narrative completes a crucial ideological turn by relocating aging from the domain of biology into the domain of moral, spiritual accounting. Time, genetics, environment, stress, illness, and socioeconomic conditions are declared insufficient explanations for physical change, unless they are accompanied by an implied spiritual deficiency. Aging is no longer something that happens to bodies. It is something that happens to people who failed to carry something correctly. This shift is not stated explicitly, but it is unmistakably encoded in the logic of the message. Once aging is moralized, appearance becomes a verdict. Youthfulness is recast as evidence of alignment, protection, or divine favor, while visible wear becomes an unspoken sign of spiritual mismanagement. The hierarchy is never named, but it is structurally enforced. Preserved bodies sit at the top, ordinary bodies in the middle, and worn bodies at the bottom. The listener is placed safely at the top of this hierarchy, not by argument, but by assumption. If they are listening, if they resonate, then they must belong to the preserved category. This maneuver is especially potent because it exploits a deeply ingrained cultural fear, the fear that suffering leaves marks. Many people carry anxiety that hardship has ruined them physically, emotionally, or socially. The narrative appears to heal this fear by offering reassurance. You went through hardship, but look, it didn't age you, it purified you. Yet this comfort is conditional. Suffering is only redeemed if it produces visible reward. Pain is not valuable in itself. It is valuable only if it yields an aesthetic dividend. In this way, endurance is validated, but only retroactively and selectively. The listener's struggles are acknowledged as real, but their legitimacy is tied to outcome. The message is not, "You suffered and that mattered," but "You suffered correctly and therefore it shows." Those whose suffering does show, wrinkles, fatigue, illness, decline, are silently excluded from this validation. Their pain is left unexplained, or worse, implicitly blamed on spiritual failure. This reframing turns appearance into a moral scoreboard. The body becomes a public receipt of invisible choices. Youthfulness is not just good fortune. It is proof of discipline, integrity, obedience, or alignment. Aging is no longer neutral. It is suggestive. The listener is not merely comforted. They are elevated above others without being asked to say so openly. The hierarchy operates quietly through implication rather than declaration. At the same time, hardship is converted into investment logic. The narrative implies a delayed return. You paid in suffering, and now you are collecting in preservation. This financial metaphor subtly reshapes how pain is remembered. Instead of being something that harmed, overwhelmed, or exceeded capacity, pain becomes something that worked. This can feel stabilizing, even redemptive, but it comes at a cost. It discourages honest acknowledgement of damage that did not result in visible reward. It also pressures the listener to continue enduring without complaint, because future payoff is always promised. Crucially, this structure makes the belief unfalsifiable. If someone looks youthful, it confirms the narrative. If they look worn, the explanation is already built in. They fail to maintain alignment, consistency, or discipline. Biology is never allowed to speak on its own terms. Evidence is filtered before it can challenge the frame.
In the end, aging is no longer a shared human condition. It is a spiritual sorting mechanism. The listener is invited to see themselves as having passed a hidden test that others failed, without ever being told what the test truly was or whether it was fair. Pain is justified only insofar as it beautifies. Those who did not receive that payoff are rendered invisible, or worse, implicitly culpable. This section tightens the system into a self-sealing interpretive loop by declaring that the external body is nothing more than a delayed echo of internal alignment. Appearance is no longer something that can be evaluated independently. It is reframed as a secondary signal whose meaning is already predetermined by the narrative. If the listener looks youthful, that youth is proof of elevation. If the listener does not yet see it, the absence is not disconfirming. It simply means the manifestation is catching up. In both cases, the conclusion remains intact. This loop is powerful because it allows belief and anticipation to reinforce each other indefinitely. Feeling aligned becomes evidence that visible change is imminent. Visible change, when perceived or imagined, becomes evidence that alignment was real all along. There is no stable point at which the claim can be tested or rejected. The listener is invited to move back and forth between inner sensation and outer expectation, never landing in a space where falsification is possible. Crucially, the narrative avoids measurable criteria entirely. There is no baseline, no timeline that can expire, no agreed-upon definition of what counts as younger, renewed, or preserved. This vagueness is not a flaw. It is functional. It allows the listener to continuously reinterpret their reflection, their photos, and others' reactions through the lens of the message. Any ambiguity becomes fertile ground for confirmation rather than doubt.
By explicitly denying external causes, genetics, skincare, nutrition, sleep, stress management, lighting, fashion, mood, or social context, the narrative asserts monopoly over explanation. These factors are not debated or weighed, they are simply dismissed as irrelevant. This is important structurally. Competing frameworks are neutralized not by refutation but by exclusion. If an explanation is never allowed to enter the frame, it never has to be disproven. This monopolization also elevates the speaker's authority. If no external system can account for what is happening, then only the narrative itself can decode the experience. The listener becomes dependent on the message to interpret their own body. Self-perception is no longer private or intuitive, it is mediated. The speaker effectively positions themselves as the translator between sensation and meaning. The result is a closed economy of interpretation. Inputs, feelings, glances, compliments, mirrors, photos, circulate inside the system and always return as validation. Nothing enters from outside unless it already agrees.
Disconfirmation is reclassified as delay, misunderstanding, or lack of perception. Doubt becomes a timing issue, not a truth issue. Psychologically, this is stabilizing in the short term. It reduces uncertainty and gives the listener a coherent story that explains both presence and absence of evidence. But it also quietly erodes agency. If appearance is guaranteed to follow alignment, then effort, choice, and practical intervention become secondary or even suspect. Waiting becomes virtue. Interpretation replaces action. In this way, the narrative does not just explain the body, it captures it. The listener's reflection becomes a screen onto which belief is projected and retrieved over and over without the possibility of contradiction. The loop tightens further by moralizing perception itself.
Seeing youth, radiance, or preservation is framed as discernment. Not seeing it becomes a sign of spiritual dullness or misalignment, either in the observer or, temporarily, in the listener. This subtly shifts evaluation away from observable reality and into the realm of character and worth. Interpretation becomes a test of faith rather than a reading of evidence. As a result, disagreement is no longer neutral, it is diagnostic. This mechanism also reassigns responsibility for contradiction. If the listener encounters aging, fatigue, illness, or insecurity, the system does not collapse. Instead, those experiences are reclassified as transitional, superficial, or externally imposed. The real truth is said to exist at a deeper, invisible level that overrides surface data. This allows the narrative to coexist with lived experiences that would otherwise challenge it, while preserving its claim to absolute explanatory power. Time plays a crucial role here. The promise of eventual visibility stretches interpretation across an indefinite future. The listener is encouraged to continuously scan themselves for signs, to compare photos, to reread comments, to wait for reactions that confirm the claim. This turns ordinary self-observation into a monitoring practice. The body becomes a site of ongoing surveillance, not for health or care, but for proof. At the same time, the denial of external causality removes practical feedback loops. If skincare, rest, nutrition, stress reduction, or medical care are dismissed as irrelevant, then improvement cannot be attributed to actionable choices. This keeps the listener emotionally invested while materially passive. Success is credited upward to alignment. Failure is deferred forward to timing. In neither case does the listener gain tools, only interpretation. Social comparison is also subtly weaponized. By implying that visible aging reflects spiritual failure, the narrative introduces a hierarchy that flatters the listener while quietly devaluing others. Compassion is preserved rhetorically, but judgment is embedded structurally. The listener is elevated without having to claim superiority explicitly. The system does it for them. Over time, this framework can narrow the listener's interpretive bandwidth. Experiences that do not fit, illness, stress, grief, aging, must either be minimized or spiritually rationalized. The cost of questioning grows because doubt no longer challenges a claim. It threatens an identity that has been carefully inflated and stabilized. What emerges is not just a belief about appearance, but a closed meaning system. The body, time, and perception are all absorbed into a single explanatory authority. The listener is no longer asked to evaluate whether the story is true, only to recognize themselves within it. And once recognition replaces evaluation, exit becomes psychologically expensive, because leaving the narrative would require reinterpreting not just the message, but one's own reflection, memories, and sense of self. This reframing completes a powerful retroactive logic. By casting past hardship as a selection process rather than circumstance, the narrative converts biography into qualification. Ordinary acts of self-control,
endurance, or moral compromise avoided are elevated into decisive moments in a hidden evaluation system. The listener is invited to scan their memory for instances that now make sense, not because new information has emerged, but because a new frame has been imposed. Memory becomes malleable, reorganized around the conclusion that preparation was always underway. Crucially, the criteria for selection are vague but flattering. Discipline, restraint, consistency. These are common traits that most listeners can locate somewhere in their past.
The lack of specificity allows nearly anyone to assemble a convincing internal dossier. The claim that these moments were recorded by celestial authorities adds an illusion of objectivity, transforming subjective recollection into alleged evidence. Private struggles gain cosmic validation without requiring verification, witnesses, or measurable outcomes. This move also neutralizes regret. Choices that did not lead to visible success are no longer mistakes. They were necessary filters. Opportunities missed were not losses, but protections. Delays were not failures of agency, but signs of being kept. In this way, the narrative offers emotional relief while quietly removing the need for critical reassessment of past decisions. Growth is no longer something to be learned or corrected toward. It is something that was already proven. At the same time, the system becomes self-sealing. If life has been painful, that pain confirms worthiness through endurance. If life improves, improvement confirms worthiness through reward. There is no outcome that falsifies the claim. Negative experiences validate the process. Positive experiences validate the selection. This resolves cognitive dissonance by eliminating the possibility that hardship was random, structural, or avoidable. The psychological payoff is significant. The listener is spared the destabilizing thought that suffering may have been meaningless or preventable. Instead, pain is metabolized into purpose. However, the cost is subtle but real. By attributing preparation entirely to unseen forces, the narrative discourages examining material causes, social conditions, mental health, chance, support systems that might otherwise inform future choices. Ultimately, this technique does more than comfort. It binds identity to interpretation. The listener is not simply someone who endured hardship. They are someone who is chosen because they endured it correctly. To question the narrative would not just reinterpret the past, it would threaten the coherence of one's entire life story. In that sense, belief is no longer about assent to an idea, but loyalty to a reconstructed self. Past hardship is not merely reinterpreted as preparation. It is converted into retroactive evidence of eligibility. The narrative does not ask whether suffering was necessary, avoidable, or meaningful in itself. Instead, it treats difficulty as a sorting mechanism, a filtration process that quietly separated those who would endure from those who would not. This reframing resolves uncertainty by removing contingency. Nothing that happened could have happened otherwise, and nothing that hurt was accidental. The listener's memory becomes a curated archive in which only moments of restraint, perseverance, or silence are highlighted, while moments of confusion, misjudgment, or failure are absorbed into the same category of training. Meaning is assigned after the fact, eliminating the possibility that pain was simply pain. By claiming that moments of discipline were recorded, the narrative objectifies private experience. Internal states, holding back anger, choosing silence, resisting impulse, are described as if they were externally verified actions logged by an unseen authority. This converts subjectivity into documentation. The listener is no longer the sole witness of their own inner life. It has supposedly been observed, evaluated, and approved elsewhere. This move grants validation without requiring evidence, while simultaneously discouraging skepticism. Doubting the narrative would mean doubting not just an idea, but the legitimacy of one's own remembered endurance. The appeal of this structure lies in its ability to resolve unresolved narratives. Many people carry fragmented stories of their past, periods that felt wasted, invisible, or unrewarded. By declaring that nothing was lost and everything was preparatory, the message closes those open loops. Regret is neutralized because alternative paths are framed as illusory. The listener did not miss opportunities. They were being preserved. They were not overlooked. They were being refined. The emotional relief is immediate, but it comes at the cost of surrendering interpretive agency. The past is no longer something to be examined critically. It has been conclusively explained. The narrative then extends this logic into the present by treating current uncertainty as transitional rather than unresolved. Ambiguity is not a signal to question direction. It is evidence that something is about to crystallize. Confusion is framed as incomplete revelation rather than lack of information. This prevents the listener from using discomfort as a diagnostic tool. Instead of asking what is missing, what is misaligned, or what needs to change, the listener is encouraged to wait for further confirmation. Passivity is rebranded as trust, and delay is sanctified as timing. Crucially, the framework does not require outcomes to materialize in order to remain intact. If visible improvement occurs, emotional relief, perceived attractiveness, attention from others, it is counted as confirmation. If it does not, the absence is reframed as evidence of a process still underway. The system is closed. There is no observable state that would falsify the claim, because both presence and absence of results are interpreted as validation. This is not accidental. It is a structural feature that allows belief to persist independent of external reality. The listener is further conditioned to reinterpret bodily sensations and emotional fluctuations as indicators of alignment. Calm becomes confirmation. Restlessness becomes anticipation. Loss becomes clearing. Desire becomes prophecy. By absorbing ordinary psychological experiences into the narrative, the message eliminates neutral ground. There is no longer a baseline human state from which to evaluate claims. Everything is already meaningful, already significant, already part of the story. This totalization ensures that the narrative accompanies the listener beyond the duration of the video, embedding itself into daily perception. Social interactions are similarly conscripted. Being noticed, complimented, or even glanced at is transformed from social contingency into metaphysical signal. The ambiguity of human perception, people notice for countless reasons, is erased in favor of a single explanation. Something has changed, and others can see it. Even confusion from others is reframed as recognition without understanding. This is a powerful technique because it converts the social world into a mirror that constantly reflects affirmation. Any form of attention, positive or uncertain, is assimilated as evidence. At the same time, the narrative subtly introduces moral hierarchy through appearance. Youthfulness, vitality, and attractiveness are not treated as products of genetics, environment, or care, but as outward manifestations of internal alignment. This creates an implicit value system in which those who look well are assumed to be spiritually successful, while those who look worn are implicitly associated with misalignment. The listener is reassured that their endurance has earned them visible reward, transforming survival into aesthetic justification. Suffering is no longer something that demands compassion or systemic explanation. It is a prerequisite for distinction. By denying external causes, biology, lifestyle, chance, the narrative monopolizes explanation. Competing frameworks are not argued against, they are simply excluded. This reduces cognitive friction. The listener is not invited to weigh possibilities, only to accept a singular interpretive lens. Complexity is replaced with coherence, which feels stabilizing but limits critical engagement. The world becomes simpler, but only because alternatives have been removed. As the message progresses, identity hardens. The listener is no longer someone who has experienced certain things. They are now a specific type of being. Labels like chosen, warrior, or demonstrated convert behavior into essence. What one has done becomes what one is. This shift is psychologically significant because it raises the cost of disengagement. To question the narrative would not merely be to reject a message, but to destabilize one's newly solidified identity. Doubt becomes self-betrayal. This identity is framed as permanent and recognized by higher authority, which removes the need for ongoing discernment. The listener does not need to evaluate future experiences critically. Their status has already been confirmed. This produces a sense of safety, while subtly discouraging growth that would require reassessment. If one is already validated, there is little incentive to examine patterns, confront blind spots, or seek external feedback that might complicate the story. The narrative also introduces a moralized version of causality. Positive outcomes are attributed to alignment, while negative outcomes, especially in others, are reframed as consequences of resistance or opposition. This creates a closed moral economy in which misfortune is rarely random. When harm occurs to those perceived as antagonistic, it is interpreted as returning energy, reinforcing a sense of cosmic justice. This absolves the listener from empathy while validating superiority. The world becomes morally legible but emotionally narrowed. Importantly, the message maintains the appearance of empowerment while steadily relocating agency elsewhere. The listener is told they are strong, disciplined, and significant, yet action is consistently replaced with compliance. The primary requirement is attention, watching, waiting, affirming, engaging. Movement, questioning, or independent decision-making are subtly framed as threats to alignment. Stillness becomes virtue. Initiative becomes risk. Responsibility is elevated upward, away from the self, while the self is praised for yielding. Engagement mechanisms are woven seamlessly into this structure. Commenting, subscribing, or sharing are not presented as platform behaviors, but as acts of agreement, even covenant. Silence is implicitly framed as fear or resistance. Reflection is replaced by declaration. This converts belief into visible action while bypassing deliberation. The listener is invited to perform alignment publicly, which deepens commitment through social signaling. Over time, this structure produces a feedback loop. Engagement reinforces identity. Identity reinforces interpretation. Interpretation reinforces belief. The listener becomes part of a community defined not by shared inquiry, but by shared affirmation. Dissent is filtered out not through argument, but through framing. Those who do not resonate were simply not chosen. This preserves internal cohesion while insulating the narrative from critique. The final effect is not overt control, but interpretive saturation. The listener is not told what to do in specific terms. They are told how to understand everything that happens. Once this lens is adopted, external guidance becomes unnecessary. Life itself becomes the medium through which the message continues to speak. Every experience, whether satisfying or painful, is already accounted for. The narrative does not need to predict the future accurately. It only needs to remain plausible enough to absorb whatever occurs. In this way, the message achieves durability. It does not rely on fulfillment to maintain loyalty, only on meaning. As long as the listener feels seen, elevated, and interpreted, the structure holds. And because it promises eventual resolution without specifying conditions, it can persist indefinitely, offering comfort, identity, and coherence, while quietly narrowing the space for genuine agency, critical reflection, and alternative understanding.
Celestial activity, framed in administrative language, performs a crucial legitimizing function. By invoking levels, categories, decrees, authorizations, and promotions, The narrative translates metaphysical claims into the vocabulary of institutions people already recognize as real. Bureaucracy is familiar, impersonal, and authoritative. It implies order, record-keeping, and due process. When spiritual activity is described this way, it no longer feels symbolic or poetic. It feels procedural. Something is not merely felt or believed, it has been processed. This linguistic shift subtly replaces faith with compliance. One does not need to understand the system. One only needs to trust that it exists and that it is functioning correctly. Through this framing, subjective inner life is converted into objective documentation. Emotions, intentions, endurance, restraint, and silence are no longer ephemeral states, but entries in an unseen file. The listener's experiences are said to have been reviewed, categorized, and escalated. This move discourages doubt in a specific way. Questioning the claim becomes equivalent to questioning whether one's own life has been noticed at all. Skepticism is no longer neutral inquiry. It risks invalidating one's suffering retroactively. If the struggle was on record, then it mattered. To doubt the system is to reopen the possibility that it did not. The idea that one's life is on file introduces a form of existential surveillance. Even though the system is described as benevolent, the implication is that nothing was unnoticed. Choices were observed, reactions were evaluated, delays were intentional. This creates comfort and pressure simultaneously. Comfort because randomness is eliminated, pressure because invisibility is no longer an option. The listener is encouraged to self-monitor, aligning thoughts and behavior with what they imagine the system rewards.
Conformity emerges not through threat, but through anticipation of continued approval. Promotion language intensifies this effect. Advancement suggests merit without specifying criteria. The listener is told they have been elevated within a hierarchy they cannot see, access, or verify. This asymmetry is key. Because the system is hidden, there is no way to confirm rank, compare status, or appeal decisions. The only evidence offered is the speaker's assertion and the listener's own reinterpretation of experience. Ambiguity becomes proof. Uncertainty itself is framed as what promotion feels like before visibility catches up. This structure mirrors familiar organizational dynamics. In opaque institutions, individuals are often told they are being considered, evaluated, or advanced behind closed doors. The lack of transparency increases dependence on authority figures who claim insider knowledge. Here, the speaker occupies that role. They do not present arguments, they deliver updates. The listener is not invited to discern. They are informed. This positions trust as the primary virtue. Understanding is unnecessary, and verification is impossible by design. By encouraging the listener to trust the system, the narrative subtly shifts agency outward. Outcomes are no longer the result of deliberate choice, strategy, or circumstance, but of administrative timing. If something has not manifested, it is because the process is incomplete. If something has been lost, it was reassigned. If confusion persists, it is because clearance has not yet been granted. The listener's role is reduced to maintaining eligibility, staying aligned, patient, and receptive, rather than actively shaping direction. This also reframes disappointment in a protective way. When expectations fail, the system absorbs blame. It was not the narrative that was wrong, it was the schedule. Not the promise that was empty, the decree has not yet been released. This preserves belief while preventing recalibration. Because the criteria are never disclosed, the listener cannot adjust behavior meaningfully, only remain compliant and hopeful. The administrative metaphor further distances the listener from their own intuition. Inner doubts are not treated as signals worth examining, but as misunderstandings of process. Emotional dissonance
is reframed as lack of clearance rather than legitimate conflict. This trains the listener to override internal feedback in favor of imagined external authorization. Over time, trust in personal discernment weakens, replaced by reliance on the narrative's interpretive framework. Importantly, the system is always described as already in motion. Files are active, reviews are ongoing, decisions have been made, even if not yet revealed. This removes urgency to question in the present. There is nothing to decide. It has already been decided elsewhere. The listener is positioned not at a crossroads, but in a waiting room. This creates psychological stasis while maintaining emotional engagement. In the end, the administrative framing accomplishes something subtle but powerful. It makes belief feel less like belief. It feels like enrollment in a process, inclusion in a structure, recognition by an authority. The listener is not merely hoping, they are cleared. Not imagining, they are documented. Not desiring, they are approved. Meaning is no longer negotiated internally, but received as status. And because the system cannot be seen, accessed, or audited, it can never be proven wrong, only endlessly trusted. By introducing tiers of preservation and exclusive categories, the narrative intensifies commitment through stratification. Blessing is no longer sufficient. The listener is said to have been reassigned, preserved, or elevated into a higher operational tier. This move does not merely flatter, it restructures identity. Once identity is defined by placement within a hierarchy, belief becomes inseparable from status.
To question the narrative is no longer to question an idea. It is to risk one's position within an imagined system of value. Hierarchy functions as an amplifier of meaning. Being placed above, beyond, or separate from most people reframes ordinary traits, resilience, restraint, sensitivity, as indicators of elite classification. The listener is not just different, they are categorically distinct. This distinction is framed as rare and selective, which makes it psychologically expensive to doubt. If only a few qualify, then skepticism threatens to collapse one's sense of uniqueness. Belief becomes self-protective. Accepting the claim preserves specialness, while rejecting it collapses identity back into the undifferentiated mass. Comparison plays a central role here. Most people are described as unpreserved, unprotected, reactive, or unaware. The listener is implicitly contrasted as stable, refined, and safeguarded. This comparison does not require evidence. It relies on emotional resonance. Any past experience of alienation, misunderstanding, or difference is retroactively explained as proof of higher placement. Social friction becomes confirmation, not contradiction. If others do not understand you, it is because they are on a lower tier. This structure also reframes fear of loss. Demotion is never explicitly threatened, but it is implied. Categories suggest boundaries, and boundaries imply eligibility. The listener is encouraged to maintain alignment, not through explicit rules, but through continued agreement. Questioning, disengaging, or seeking alternative explanations subtly becomes a risk behavior. Silence can be interpreted as drift. Doubt becomes not curiosity, but instability. The safest position is continued identification with the narrative. By escalating significance through tiers, the message also resolves ambiguity around worth. Instead of asking whether one's life has meaning, the listener is told what kind of meaning it has, and that it is uncommon. This relieves existential uncertainty while narrowing interpretive freedom. Meaning is no longer something to be explored, it is something to be maintained. Ultimately, the tiered structure does not just elevate the listener above others, it binds them more tightly to the system that named the tiers. Superiority is conditional, sustained only through ongoing acceptance. The hierarchy flatters, but it also encloses. Identity becomes vertical rather than relational, and belonging is secured not through connection, but through rank. The escalation of tiers and categories completes the architecture of control by turning belief into classification. Once the listener is told they have been moved into a higher level, the narrative no longer needs to persuade, it only needs to remind. Identity becomes bureaucratic rather than experiential. You're not feeling different because of mood, circumstance, or interpretation. You are different because a file was updated somewhere beyond access. This removes the need for evidence, while simultaneously making doubt feel like a misunderstanding of status rather than a disagreement with claims. A demonstrative language does crucial psychological work here. Words like level, assignment, decree, preservation class, and authorization borrow credibility from modern institutions that govern real outcomes: courts, hospitals, governments, corporations. The listener has been conditioned by daily life to respect systems they cannot see but must obey. By mirroring that structure, the message feels familiar and legitimate, even as it remains unverifiable. Spiritual power is no longer mystical or relational. It is clerical. Something has been stamped, approved, processed. This also reframes uncertainty. When outcomes do not change, the explanation is not failure, but processing time. Files are pending. Transfers are in progress.
Delays are procedural, not personal. This shields the narrative from falsification while protecting the listener's self-image. Nothing is wrong with you. The system simply hasn't executed yet. Patience becomes compliance, not resilience. Hierarchy intensifies emotional investment through scarcity. If only a few reach this level, belonging becomes precious. The listener is encouraged to compare themselves downward, most people, rather than laterally. Others are still struggling, aging, confused, stuck in lower categories. This contrast does two things at once. It validates the listener's pain as proof of exceptional refinement, and it discourages empathy that might destabilize the narrative. If others suffer, it is because they are unprocessed, unassigned, or misaligned. Structural inequality is spiritualized. Questioning now carries risk. To doubt the message is not merely to disagree with an idea, it is to challenge one's own classification. If you have been promoted, questioning sounds like ingratitude. If you have been preserved, skepticism feels like contamination. The fear is subtle but powerful. What if doubt disqualifies me? The listener learns to self-police thoughts, filtering interpretation through the lens of status protection. The narrative further tightens its hold by redefining humility. Humility is no longer critical self-examination or openness to correction. It is silent acceptance of assignment. To accept without asking becomes virtuous. Curiosity becomes unnecessary. Discernment is reframed as resistance. This inversion allows the message to present itself as honoring the listener's dignity while actually narrowing their agency. You are trusted precisely because you do not question. At this stage, the listener's past, present, and future are fully enclosed within the system. The past was training and documentation. The present is classification and monitoring. The future is scheduled release and visible reward. There is no external reference point left. Even alternative spiritual frameworks are implicitly demoted as lower-level operations. Therapy becomes unnecessary because healing is procedural. Community becomes optional because assignment is individual. Effort becomes secondary because status is already granted. Importantly, the system preserves emotional volatility while claiming peace. Anticipation is encouraged, not resolution. The listener is told they are calm, aligned, and elevated, yet also on the brink of imminent change. This creates a productive tension. Enough reassurance to prevent collapse, enough suspense to maintain engagement. Peace is defined not as rest, but as certainty without evidence. The introduction of preservation tiers also reframes vulnerability. Struggle is no longer a sign of fragility, but of containment. The listener is not struggling because they are weak. They are restricted because they are dangerous to the status quo. This flatters while isolating. If you feel misunderstood, it is because you are advanced. If you feel lonely, it is because you are categorized differently. Social disconnection is no longer something to resolve. It is something to protect. This logic extends into moral interpretation. Good outcomes validate alignment. Bad outcomes validate opposition. Neutral outcomes validate processing. There is no experiential data that can challenge the frame. Every possible result is absorbed and repurposed. The system is closed. By the time the listener reaches this point, belief has shifted from content to structure. It no longer matters what is promised: youth, wealth, relationships, peace. What matters is belonging to the category that receives promises. Desire is abstracted into entitlement. The listener is not hoping anymore. They are waiting for delivery. The final psychological lock is subtle. Responsibility is outsourced upward, while identity is locked inward. Outcomes are God's timing. Interpretation is the system's authority, but belief, attention, and loyalty remain the listener's duty. If nothing happens, the only actionable response is deeper alignment, more silence, more agreement, more waiting. Exit is possible only by accepting demotion, error, or deception, which now feels like self-annihilation. In this way, the narrative does not need to threaten explicitly. It offers honor instead. And once honor is accepted, withdrawal feels like loss. This reframing completes the moral insulation of the system. Criticism is no longer information to evaluate, but evidence of impact. Hostility is not disagreement, it is exposure. By asserting that opposition only arises when one is a threat, the narrative converts social friction into a diagnostic tool that always favors the listener. Any pushback, whether thoughtful critique, concern, or outright hostility, is collapsed into the same category: confirmation. Crucially, harm is externalized from intention. The listener is told they do nothing to their enemies. Consequences simply unfold through impersonal spiritual law. This preserves a sense of innocence while allowing emotional gratification. If others suffer, it is not because of revenge, judgment, or indifference. It is because reality itself has aligned in the listener's favor. Responsibility is dissolved without relinquishing benefit. Moral agency is bypassed, but moral superiority is retained. This structure legitimizes Schadenfreude without naming it. Satisfaction at another's downfall can be experienced without guilt because it is framed as observation, not desire. The listener is merely witnessing how the system works. Pain elsewhere becomes proof of order, not a call to compassion. In this way, empathy is quietly reclassified as unnecessary or even naive. To feel concern for those who oppose you would be to misunderstand spiritual mechanics. The narrative also eliminates the need for proportionality. Minor slights and major harms are treated the same because causality is abstracted.
A dismissive comment and an act of cruelty both trigger identical spiritual consequences. This flattens ethical nuance and discourages reflection on one's own reactions. If all opposition backfires automatically, there is no incentive to distinguish between justified critique and malicious attack. Everything resolves in the listener's favor by default. By presenting suffering as an automatic outcome of touching the wrong anointing, the system becomes self-policing. The listener need not confront, set boundaries, or communicate. Silence is framed as power, withdrawal as wisdom. Social rupture is not something to repair, but something to interpret.
Broken relationships are explained upward rather than addressed horizontally. Accountability is replaced with metaphysics. This move also seals the belief system against moral scrutiny from outside. If critics are suffering, they are disqualified as moral voices. If critics are thriving, their success can be reinterpreted as temporary, counterfeit, or irrelevant to true status. Either way, external ethical challenge is neutralized. There is no position from which an outsider can question the system without being absorbed into it as evidence. Importantly, this reframing preserves the listener's self-image as gentle and restrained. They are not aggressive, the universe is. They are not judgmental, law is impersonal. This allows the listener to maintain an identity of compassion while participating in a worldview that explains others' pain as deserved. The dissonance is resolved by abstraction. Suffering is no longer relational, it is mechanical. Over time, this logic trains emotional detachment. When harm befalls others, curiosity replaces concern. The question is not what happened to them, but what principle did they violate? Human stories are flattened into case studies. Complexity is replaced by compliance with the narrative's rule set. The final effect is closure. Moral ambiguity, which might otherwise provoke doubt or reflection, is eliminated. The world becomes legible and reassuringly punitive in the right direction. Those aligned are protected, those opposed are corrected, automatically, invisibly, inevitably. The listener is relieved of both blame and responsibility, free to interpret outcomes as validation rather than invitation to ethical engagement. At this point, belief no longer rests on hope of reward alone. It is sustained by the comfort of moral certainty. And systems built on certainty, once internalized, are the hardest to leave. This move completes the totalization of the framework. By absorbing every major life domain, mind, emotions, finances, relationships, into a single preservation narrative, the message eliminates interpretive escape routes. There is no longer a category of experience that can be understood as ordinary, accidental, or the result of skill, luck, therapy, or circumstance. Psychological resilience is no longer coping, it is divine shielding. Financial stability is no longer budgeting or opportunity, it is supernatural insulation. Healthy boundaries are no longer learned behaviors, they are evidence of elevation. Life itself becomes a closed system of signs. What makes this effective is not the claim itself, but the coherence it promises. Humans are meaning-making creatures, and incoherence is stressful. By offering a framework in which everything aligns, in a calm, external provision, relational shifts, the narrative relieves the listener of ambiguity. Nothing is random, nothing is merely how life goes, and nothing is wasted. Every outcome fits. Coherence becomes emotional safety. This reframing also collapses multidimensional causality into a single axis. Complex interactions between personality, environment, culture, trauma, effort, and chance are flattened into one explanation: preservation. This simplification feels clarifying, even comforting, because it reduces cognitive load. Instead of holding competing explanations in tension, the listener learns to default to one. The world becomes easier to read, even if less accurate. Neutrality is the real casualty here. In ordinary life, many experiences are simply neutral, neither success nor failure, neither sign nor signal. Neutrality allows for rest, experimentation, and uncertainty. By removing it, the narrative ensures constant significance. Every calm moment is protection. Every loss is pruning. Every delay is containment. This produces a heightened sense of meaning, but also a subtle pressure. Nothing can just be nothing.
Training the listener to see coherence everywhere reshapes perception itself. Pattern recognition, normally a flexible cognitive skill, becomes compulsory. The listener is not merely encouraged to interpret events through the framework. They are taught that interpretation is the only faithful response. To see an experience as ordinary is to miss its meaning. To question the pattern is to risk disalignment. Over time, perception narrows around the narrative's logic. This also safeguards the system against contradiction. If an outcome is positive, it confirms preservation. If it is negative, it confirms protection through restriction. If it is mixed or confusing, it confirms hidden order not yet revealed. Coherence is never threatened because it is retroactively assigned. Meaning is not discovered. It is imposed after the fact. Importantly, this absorption preserves dignity while limiting agency. The listener is affirmed as protected, covered, sustained, but not as an active interpreter or decision-maker. Their role is not to analyze causes or weigh alternatives, but to recognize alignment. Life becomes something happening to them on their behalf, rather than something they are co-creating through choices, skills, and relationships. Agency is softened into gratitude. The result is a worldview that feels spacious, but functions narrowly.
It can explain everything, which means it does not have to examine anything. Coherence replaces curiosity. Interpretation replaces inquiry. And once the listener is trained to see meaning everywhere, disengaging from the framework no longer feels like changing an idea. It feels like losing the ability to understand reality itself. This technique introduces the illusion of precision without the risk of verification. By naming specific windows, 72 hours, 30 days, 90 days, the narrative simulates accountability while quietly avoiding it. Numbers feel concrete. They signal structure, planning, and intention. To the listener, time-bound language implies that something measurable is about to occur, which heightens anticipation and emotional investment. Yet, the predictions themselves are not tied to defined outcomes, only to states of awareness, encounters, shifts, or movement. Time is specified, events are not. The psychological effect is powerful. Anticipation activates hope, and hope sustains attention. The listener begins scanning their environment for signs, primed to notice anything that could plausibly fit the promise. A conversation, a message, a dream, a moment of calm. Any of these can be retroactively labeled as fulfillment. Because the criteria were never fixed, interpretation does all the work. The timeline feels honored, even when nothing objectively changes. Crucially, failure is never located in the narrative. When the promised window passes without a satisfying outcome, responsibility is redirected inward. The listener is told, implicitly or explicitly, that alignment, readiness, faith, or consistency was incomplete. This reframing preserves the authority of the message while subtly inducing self-surveillance. Rather than questioning the claim, the listener questions themselves. Doubt becomes a personal flaw, not a rational response. This creates a self-correcting belief loop. If something happens within the window, it confirms the message. If nothing happens, the listener is encouraged to adjust their inner state and wait for the next window. Each cycle renews hope without requiring the narrative to evolve. Accountability is replaced by postponement. The staggered timelines also prevent closure. Short windows, like 72 hours, generate urgency and excitement. Longer windows, like 90 days, provide endurance and justification for continued attention. Together, they structure belief across time, ensuring that there is always a next phase approaching. The listener is never fully disappointed because the story is never fully finished. Importantly, this system converts time itself into evidence. Waiting becomes participation. Endurance becomes faith. The mere act of continuing to watch, listen, comment, or reflect is framed as progress. Nothing external needs to change for the listener to feel that something is changing. In this way, hope is preserved without accountability, and meaning is sustained without results. The narrative does not fail when predictions miss. It simply absorbs the miss as part of the process. The listener remains suspended between expectation and reinterpretation, emotionally invested, perpetually on the verge of fulfillment, always close enough to keep believing, never close enough to conclude.